It's my very great pleasure to welcome Kimani and Njogu, who prepared today's talk together with Alamin Mazrui, who unfortunately can't attend for health reasons. I'm so grateful to both of them for giving us an insight into Ngũgĩ and the quest for paradigm shift between language and translation. Alamin Mazrui is professor of sociolinguistics, literature, and comparative cultural studies at Rutgers University in New Jersey in the USA. He has a special interest in human rights and civil liberties, and he has also written policy reports on these issues. And he's also a published Swahili poet and playwright. And Kimani Njogu, who is going to present this talk, is director of the Twaweza Communication Center, which is an arts, cultural, and media organization based in Nairobi, Kenya. He holds a PhD in linguistics from Yale University and taught for many years Kiswahili and African languages at Kenyatta University, and is now working more directly within civil society. And he has led a team of translators to translate into Kiswahili key documents for the Constitution of Kenya Review Commission, including the draft Constitution of Kenya, but he has also translated literary works. So without further ado, I will give the word to Kimani, and we're very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you very much, Johanna and colleagues, for really giving us the opportunity to share with you some reflections on Ngũgĩ and translation. And I must bring Alamin's apologies. Alamin is not feeling well. We've worked together, consistently over the last couple of years on some of these issues, and was in touch with him today again. It's just that a pity that his health is not very good. So we want to reflect together on this question of translation. So our topic really is on Ngũgĩ and the quest for a paradigm shift between language and translation. And we are trying to look at the ways in which Ngũgĩ's understanding of language and thought and culture it can be helpful to translation studies. So I will, because this paper is jointly prepared, I will try to go deeper into the paper itself, even as I share some slides along the way. And in terms of introduction, we are saying that there has been some consensus that the primary developmental problem in many nations of the South is not structural adjustments as we know them and as defined by Bretton Woods institutions. The problem, rather, in our view, is how to conduct a cultural readjustment. And one function of culture is to provide a universe of cognition and perception, a societal paradigm, a worldview. In his groundbreaking work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kahn offered new insights about how the process through which scientific paradigms shift and new alternative systems of explaining phenomena that come to dominate scientific thought emerged. But what about shifts in cultural paradigms? If we know the shifts in scientific paradigms, how do shifts in cultural paradigms operate? Our presentation today will focus on the imperative of paradigm shift in the cultural arena in post-colonial, of course, post-colonial in quotes, societies, with special attention to the question of Ngũgĩ, the question of language as articulated and expressed by Ngũgĩ in a number of his writings. Ngũgĩ's quest for a paradigm shift was based on a particular reading of the connection between language, culture, and thought that he articulated in his 1986 publication, Decolonizing the Mind. Ngũgĩ's views in Decolonizing the Mind established precisely the kind of relationship between language, culture, and cognition that inspired interpretations of his position as a quest for authenticity. Let me just go back to Ngũgĩ's position, and basically his position is the relationship between language, culture, and cognition. And in our view, this was his quest for authenticity. In fact, almost in terms of what would say the African self. Ngũgĩ's perspective here was akin to the views of thinkers such as Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Hove, whose main thesis is best known as linguistic relativism, or just the Sapir-Hove hypothesis. Like Ngũgĩ, Hove had argued, for example, that languages influence or even determine human perceptions of their world in a culturally subscribed manner. By the mid-1960s, however, these Hofian claims were deemed to have fallen into disrepute. Of course, here we are talking about the stronger version of the hypothesis. The development of cognitive linguistics in the 1980s, however, helped to rekindle the interest in linguistic relativism, and some cognitive linguistic studies began to suggest that how we organize, categorize and classify experience of our real world is not only manifest in language, but can also be influenced by language. So that, in a sense, the idea here is that we are influenced in terms of our thinking by language and experience, and that our languages do also influence the ways in which we perceive the world. While the strong deterministic thesis that language determines thought continues to be rejected, Philip Wolff and Kevin Holmes suggest that recent findings support a range of alternative ways in which language might be considered to have significant effects on thought, leading to possible differences in thought across language communities. These findings essentially give Ngũgĩ's position a degree of scientific validation. So I think that this reimagining of linguistic relativism is a consequence of cognitive linguistics and the ways in which we process information. In addition to the potential influence of language and thought, however, is its more apparent impact on epistemological location. As Ngũgĩ has argued, the dependence of European languages has resulted in a situation in which knowledge that is generated about Africa is consequently assembled in non-African languages. So we assemble language about Africa in non-African languages. And this assemblage, in Ngũgĩ's opinion, is part of the process by which Africa continues to be interpreted through a Western linguistic and, by implication, epistemological prism. The entire Europhonic process or project then is regarded in Ngũgĩ's world as parasitic. It is only content on taking away and never giving anything back to the languages and peoples on whose behalf it makes its claims in the global community of scholarship in arts, science, and technology. The epistemological course for Africa of this pyramid of linguistic privilege, or what Ngũgĩ has called linguistic feudalism, in other words, has been absolutely immense. So that the knowledge about Africa is harvested and assembled, in the global north in languages that are not African languages. It is in view of this epistemological consideration that Ngũgĩ calls for a paradigmatic linguistic shift, which, in his opinion, may go some distance in liberating African intellectual discourse from its Western confines, and in the process, creating a new room for theoretical and methodological innovation. The situation may be compared with the liberation of European philosophy from the fetters of Latin as the medium of philosophical discourse in the 18th century. And this is where we bring in Kai Kresse for, in terms of his claim, and I think you have, you can recall, what Latin opening up, itself to other languages did for Europe and the philosophy coming out of Europe. According to Kai Kresse, philosophy was now no more principally restricted to Latin-speaking elite through a shift in the use of language, which had to do with a shift of power constellation. It opened up for secular topics and social contexts. The educated Latin-speaking elite of philosophers lost its unifying scientific language, but the gain, on the other hand, was ultimately much higher. In switching philosophy to the regional languages, a social interplay and discourse could more directly take place. Academic philosophy was now, at least in principle, more generally accessible to the illiterate to whom the text could be read. So you have a situation where Latin gives way to other languages and opening itself to philosophy, making philosophy accessible to other people. And I think that part of the argument in this particular case is that once you restrict language, you open it up you open philosophy to popular, popular spaces and popular communities. Now, I want to move on to a different idea here, to argue that a linguistic revolution on the African Academy has the potential of generating new spaces for new epistemological inscriptions that could allow new alternatives to emerge as real possibilities for the continent. But the proposed linguistic paradigm shift must begin with some political will, and that's why now I'm bringing the junta to try and ask questions on what it means for for West Africa, the so-called Francophone Africa. The recent military coups in nations of the so-called Francafrique, for example, raise once more the question about the extent to which the French language is embedded in those societies. The juntas have been emphatic about terminating military contracts with France and have been quick to join the popular wave of condemnation of France's financial and extractive economic control of its West African partners. I mean, we are familiar with the argument that the juntas have raised. But neither the military regimes nor the general public has yet to put on the agenda the possibility of rethinking the role of the French language and culture in African education and governance. On the contrary, even the popular opposition to France has often been articulated in the same imperial language, that linguistic umbilical cord that continues to bind the region to France. The only exception is Mali, that at least has taken a symbolic step to demote French from one of its official languages to a working language. The United States and Europe have been calling for a return to a constitutional order in these countries of Franco-Afrique. But it has never occurred to these countries, that is the United States as well as European countries, that the very fact that French has been the exclusive language of the constitutions of these African nations might itself have been one of the reasons for the perceived irrelevance of the constitutional order. Under these circumstances, the obituaries we see about the death of Francafrique may well be somewhat premature. As France's occupation continues to be challenged, the United States and Europe have expressed concern about Russia and China moving in to take its place. With regard to China in particular, its presence is already significant enough for Howard French to have called Africa China's second continent. And of course, I mean, we are connected to China in fundamental ways. I have personally been requested by Chinese publishing firms to consider translating some of their books into Kiswahili and to publish these books. Okay. And yet, so far, China's investments in Africa have not been accompanied by an attempted imposition of Mandarin. It is true, of course, that China has several Confucius institutes in Africa, as it does elsewhere in the world, but that offer courses in Mandarin. But it's also true that Chinese enterprise in Africa has shown great interest in the study of African languages and even in offering degree courses in some of those languages in China. If this Afro-Chinese relationship grows, we might even ask if China's demonstrated interest in African languages might be one day become the catalyst for some form of recentering of African languages in education and public sphere. But it is not enough, really, to adopt African languages for African needs. African languages themselves need to be seen as cultural forms of technology that must be subjected to creative engineering if they are to be compatible with their time. That is, if they are to be sufficiently empowered to meet the challenges of a scientific age. It is precisely this combination of linguistic commitment to one's own, that is, securing the base, as Ngũgĩ would put it, and linguistic engineering, that constantly engages with developments in the world of science and technology that, in the words of Jing Tsu of Yale University, culminated in what she calls the language revolution that made China modern. However, a language cannot be developed merely by appointing a special commission with the task of coining technical terms, and we have seen this in Tanzania with Baraza la Kiswahili la Taifa. We have seen this in a number of places where we have the national councils, national language councils, that really work towards development of technical terms. A language has to be developed through facing new challenges, confronting new ideas which need to be expressed, and so on. So how do you express the new ideas? So it's not just the terminology, but there are also new ideas. I was recently involved in translating a legal document related to coal mining in Lamu from English to Kiswahili. And I can assure you it was one of the most challenging tasks. As Julius Nyerere once said with regard to Swahili, for example, Kiswahili ni lugha tamu na pana sana, lakini utamu wake hauna budi utumiwe zaidi, ndipo utakapoongezeka. So in essence, what Julius Nyerere is saying here is that Swahili is a very beautiful and rich language, but its beauty and richness can be augmented only if it is put to novel uses, That is by forcing the language to carry and communicate the conceptual worlds of other civilizations. That language, whether it's Swahili or Kikuyu or the Luo or any of these African languages, would need to carry, the ideas from other territories. And the wider range of civilizations on which such challenges are based, the richer the potential stimulation of African languages. That is why, short of establishing a specialized bureau, the task of translation must be treated as an integral part of the efforts to empower African languages. So it becomes an effort to empower, to enrich, African languages. Naturally, this consideration brings us to another of Ngũgĩ's major concerns, the concern with translation. Ngũgĩ has been, for a long time, advocating for greater use of translation, or what he calls language of languages, as a means of enriching African languages and fostering the dialogue of civilizations. So far, translation efforts in Africa have leaned excessively on the side of texts from Europe or composed in European languages, be it from the Bible or Shakespeare or even Karl Marx. But when will the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore or the Chinese philosopher Confucius, that is Confucius, be available in African languages? Translations of the Quran have now appeared in a few African languages, and so have the Arabian Nights and a few other publications. But what about the more recent classics of the culture of Islam? A good experiential example of this interconnection between a linguistic paradigm shift and translation is that of the Arabic language and the field of science. In the Muslim world of the medieval period, especially under Abbasid Caliphate, that is 750 to 1258, science is said to have been practiced on a scale unprecedented in human history, in that period. Such considerable resources were devoted to its promotion that until the rise of modern science, no other civilization engaged as many scientists, produced as many scientific books, or provided as varied and sustained support for scientific activity as did the Islamic civilization. Underlying this phenomenal growth of science under the Islamic dispensation, however, was the power of language, in particular, the rise of Arabic as a medium of wider communication. The scientific movement itself inspired a good deal of linguistic engineering, which helped turn Arabic into a scientific language, partly through the adoption and adaptation of terms from other languages. On the other hand, the currency of a rapidly scientificating Arabic served as an important stimulus to the growth of scientific culture within the Muslim world. Many important works were produced directly in Arabic language, but there also arose a conscientious effort to translate scientific works from languages like Persian, Hindi, and Greek, and in the process fostering new levels of scientific exchange between cultures and civilizations. These translations contributed not only to the growth of scientific knowledge available in Arabic, but also to the formation of a scientific limb in the language, a terminological legacy which ultimately found its way into languages of the West in the form of words such as algebra, alchemy, alcohol, zero, and many others. The language of Quranic revelation had now become an international medium of scientific discourse. So you have the origination of scientific language, but also the translation of these ideas and the acceleration of the language of science in Arabic. It is not only surprising, then, that during the period of Islamic history, efforts in science went hand in hand with the development efforts in language. Ahmed Dalal reminds us that in addition to religious works, the earliest scholarly contributions among Muslims were of a linguistic nature. Of particular relevance to the later development of science were the extensive compilation efforts by philologists and lexicographers, the specialized lexicons that were produced represent a large-scale attempt at classifying Arabic knowledge. In other words, the Arabic linguistic revolution was perhaps one of the most important cultural transformations to have occurred within the Muslim world. And this communicative device, especially because it was not limited to the elite, became an important instrument in the stimulation of a scientific culture in the society at large. Now, of course, we realize that there are major differences between the Islamic world of the Abbasids and the African realities of the 21st century. Nonetheless, we believe that the basic argument is still defensible, that linguistic engineering and scientific socialization are mutually stimulating and mutually enriching phenomena. With the right kind of linguistic policy, it is possible to pursue this lingo-scientific agenda, and without some African languages posing a threat to others, as Arabic may have done in parts of North Africa. We are aware of the challenge of Arabic on some languages in North Africa. Here, we would like to underscore the distinction between scientific knowledge and scientific culture. Scientific knowledge can indeed be acquired in any language, with English being particularly resourceful under the current conditions of globalization. So we are moving on to that distinction between scientific knowledge and scientific culture. For the development of a scientific culture, however, for the scientific to become part of a system of values and mode of thinking, an integral dimension of a people's intellectual orientation with citizens having adequate scientific literacy, we believe the employment of an instructional language that is close to other local languages of the people is crucial. In fact, Professor Mohamed Abdelaziz, the late Professor Mohamed Abdelaziz, did argue sufficiently that African nations cannot become technologically savvy if they continue depending on languages of the global north, and that translation is critical for Africa to own up to the technology and the sciences that they encounter. Much has been made of the idea that science is something out there or universal, existing above and beyond the dictates of cultural context within which it operates. But as Kovac of the European Molecular Biology Organization argues, science is indeed a scientific part of culture. It is an essential part of culture. Raymond Welder has also demonstrated in his book, Mathematics as a Cultural System, that even the purest of the sciences is ultimately a subculture of the general culture, and its development is often subject to wider cultural flows and currents. I think this distinction between science, what constitutes science and what constitutes culture, is of course always problematic. We understand that there has been some debate in Malaysia about whether or not to reintroduce English as the primary medium of instruction for the sciences and mathematics. And reference is made in this regard to a statement by the former Prime Minister, Mahathir Mohamad, about the necessity of science instruction in the English language to realize the goal of his Vision 2020, of getting Malaysia recognized as an advanced world country. He is reported to have said, education is for the purpose of acquiring knowledge, which is, in our view, a rather reductionist position on the goal of education. If you have to use a language which makes the knowledge more accessible, you should use that language. Historically, the Europeans learned Arabic in order to access the knowledge of the Arabs. So if you want knowledge, you have to acquire the language in which knowledge is available. The Prime Minister is, of course, right that Malaysia should acquire English. And of course, if possible, they should also acquire French, Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, and so forth. All in an attempt to access forms of knowledge available in these languages. It's also true that Europeans learned Arabic to access knowledge of the Arabs, as Arabs before them learned Greek to gain access to knowledge of development and in philosophy and the sciences. The bottom line, however, is that the Arabs did not use Greek, nor the Europeans used Arabic as their respective media of instruction. So even when they have acquired the knowledge, from those languages, they did not use that as their language of instruction. The Europeans learned Arabic in order to access Arabic produced knowledge in their own European languages, just as the Arabs learned Greek in order to make Greek knowledge available in Arabic. And all was done through translation. It is precisely this linguistic localization of scientific knowledge that helped Arabs and Europeans to foster a culture of science in their societies, and that ultimately enabled them to become agents of scientific innovation and contributors to the world heritage in the sciences and other disciplines. What all this background information suggests then is that if Africans seek to become players and contributors to the world of science, then Africa must transcend the mere quest for scientific knowledge. It must seek creative ways of making scientific knowledge organically, connected to African cultural organism. We believe that such a paradigmatic shift can only be achieved through an intellectual transformation rooted in the languages of the relevant societies. It's only when a discipline has become a component of a people's cultural sensibility that it can trigger, senses of ownership of its body of knowledge in a way that could generate the degree of confidence necessary in stimulating the creative impulse and releasing creative potential as a foundation of scientific discovery and innovation. So here we are really more interested in creating a distinction between scientific knowledge, which can be acquired generally, and scientific culture that can be rooted and ought to be rooted in the cultures and languages of communities. To be clear, we are not suggesting here that the adoption of African languages alone is a sufficient condition for the continent's economic and scientific advancement. The claim, rather, is that among the forces necessary for laying a more robust economic and scientific foundation, a linguistic paradigm shift of the kind that Ngũgĩ proposes is actually necessary. It is indispensable. The diversity of vision arising from multiple civilizational sources of translation, furthermore, must not only come from outside Africa, it must also benefit from Africa's own intellectual experiences and heritage. It's partly this consideration that led Ngũgĩ to be a strong proponent of translation between African languages. Ngũgĩ's fundamental argument is that African languages ought to enrich each other, and he really does advance, intra-African dialogue. Ngũgĩ put his call for intra-African translation into action soon after his release from prison. Both his pre-detention Gikuyu play, Gahikandenda, I Will Marry When I Want, initially staged as one of the projects of the political underground to which Ngũgĩ belonged, and his in-detention Gikuyu novel, Shaitani Mudharavaine, Devil on the Cross, Both of these works appeared in Swahili translation in 1982, which is precisely the year that Alamin Mazrui was arrested and imprisoned. Gahi Kandenda and its newly released Swahili version, Nitaolewa Nikipenda, and English translation, I'll Marry When I Want, were among the items that the officers of the special branch, this is the police, took when they came to search Alamin's home and office before finally apprehending him. It's very interesting that when the special branch came to arrest Alamin, they took both the Gikuyu and the Kiswahili translations of Ngũgĩ's books. When they finally got to interrogating him, the police officers displayed a certain unease about the ownership of the Gikuyu version of the play. Why was Alamin in possession of a Gikuyu play? Wewe si Mkikuyu? Kwa nini unanunua hii? Au umenunuliwa na Wakikuyu? You are not Kikuyu? Why did you purchase this? Or have you been bought by Kukes? They called them Kukes. They asked. He explained that he was considering including the Swahili version of the play in the list of required texts for his Kiswahili literature class, and that a friend had been going over the Gikuyu original with him to help him better connect the two versions. As you may know, in Kenya, translated work in the Kiswahili imagination is often considered to be distinct from the original, and sometimes may be treated as part of the corpus of works in the target language, so that you have Shamba la Wanyama examined as a Kiswahili, Shamba la Wanyama, which is Animal Farm, examined as a Kiswahili literary work in the national exams. And that has happened with quite a few other translated works. Alamin's response triggered a host of other hostile questions that betrayed great anxiety that his adoption of the Swahili translation of Ngũgĩ's Gikuyu play was just another clandestine move to smuggle subversive ideas from one African language to another. I want to move briefly to the question of translating the Constitution, as well as toward an intra-African translation. In the last couple of years, Kenya has held some discussion about intra-African translation of the country's constitution. And so far, the officially adopted version of the Constitution of Kenya is the English version. There is, however, an official Swahili version, or Katiba ya Kenya, which is available and which was translated by Uraia Trust. And the Kiswahili translation is motivated by Article 7 of the Constitution of Kenya, which states that Kenya has two co-official languages, Kiswahili and English. Therefore, Kiswahili is a co-official language as well as a national language for Kenya. There is a clear realization in the Constitution that there may be attempts to produce other non-English versions of the Constitution. What the Constitution says that if there is a conflict between the English version and other versions, other translated versions, the English version will always take precedence. Now, the question has arisen quite a bit as to whether efforts to translate the Constitution into other Kenyan languages should be based on the English version or the Swahili version if it becomes officially mandated. So should we be translating, from English to Gikuyu or the Luo or Kalenjin, or should we translate from Kiswahili to other Kenyan languages? So should should we treat the Kiswahili version as the original, as the source language for other Kenyan languages? Our own inclination is to take the Swahili version of the Constitution as the source text upon which translation into other African, that is target languages, would be based. One compelling reason is the linguistic, which is basically the structural and cultural proximity that exists between Swahili and most of the languages of Kenya, which would help facilitate the process of translation. In addition, Swahili has a rich legal and constitutional vocabulary arising from its long history of intimate contact with the Arabo-Islamic world, its extensive use in German and French colonial administration, its agency in anti-colonial struggles, its presence in schools as a medium of as a language of learning, not necessarily as a medium of instruction, but actually as one of the languages that's taught in our schools, as well as its instrumental role in national and regional integration, both informally at the lower horizontal level, where our people are undertaking, commercial activities in Eastern Africa through Kiswahili, or formally through a structure such as the East African Community, which has stated that Kiswahili is one of the official, is a lingua franca of the community. So we are aware of the challenge and the challenge of translation, from English to other African languages. Now we have, of course, recognized the value of this, translation. Unfortunately, of course, we are also aware of the fact that East Africans do not have access to Yoruba, so the intra-African competencies, or rather access to other African languages by African scholars and translators is very, very limited. So we are aware of that challenge, and we have to be able to deal with it. We are also aware of the opportunity that suddenly we have through artificial intelligence, and we are imagining a situation where it will facilitate translation even more effectively. So what is our takeaway as I wrap up? So Ngũgĩ is pushing for intra-African translation, not just as an intellectual endeavor, but also as an activist endeavor, as a developmental and transformative endeavor. His plays have been translated into a number of languages, but principally Swahili. The fact that security agents have been interested, in these translated works, suggesting that that translated works are powerful. But of course, there is complexity of translated works and identity. Is Animal Farm a Kiswahili novel, or is it an English novel? And what is it, and so on. And therefore, this contestation of identity. I think that's all we would like to say. Just to say that Ngũgĩ's work in translation is well grounded in terms of our understanding of the cultural shifts that are required, and that we think that to make science more relevant and valuable to Africa, we do need to pay particular attention to translation from different languages, not just from English. We need translation from Arabic, from Chinese, from Hindi, as well as other languages. So thank you so much. I think that's all I wanted to share with you.
Thank you. Christian, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. You've given us a very, very impressive panorama. You've pointed out the immense linguistic diversity in Africa. linguistic and cultural diversity are part of the human heritage which we should cherish and which is constantly under danger. You've given us examples of the malicious impact of a colonial language in East Africa. You've looked at other languages that have also become powerful for various reasons, like Chinese. Fascinating stuff. The language with the most native speakers in the world, the community of speakers entering into contact with Africa, Arabic, problematically North Africa, more beneficial. Well, I suppose we have to start somewhere. And I see the danger that you can't break the link between language and power because it's deeper than colonialism. English is a powerful language all over the world, partly because it's so often used as a lingua franca by people like you and me so that we can talk to each other. There's another school of thought in my discipline, World Englishes, which argues that African Englishes can become a vehicle for authentic cultural expression. They will point out writers like Achebe, who faced the same problems as Ngũgĩ, found a different answer. There are people who would argue that in Kenya, there are creative multilingual practices involving English, Sheng, that in West Africa, they're pidgins, and that all this shows that the oppressed colonial subject can turn the tables on the colonizers, make the colonizers' language their own, use it for their own purposes, manage it as part of a multilingual repertoire. Is that narrative delusional, or is there some potential in that alternative narrative too, just to get us going? So
yeah, I don't think that it's I don't think that it is delusional. I think it's an important narrative to carry along. We are aware of what happens to languages once they are in contact. I mean, and the ways in which people can own that which is presented to them to advantage and so on. And I think that it is important for us to recognize the role of, you know, the Englishes that exist on the continent, and even Sheng, you know, but that these forms, these languages also are creating culture, you know. They are creating particular cultures along the way. But we haven't seen, we are yet to see this stabilization of those cultures. I can see a situation where in future, you know, some of the most innovative work will be done through Sheng, for example. And I think that we should be able to celebrate that. And that's why we talk about linguistic diversity and the accommodation of different modes of communication. So it's not delusional. I think that we also have to pay attention to the levels of literacy. So where who has access to English to generate the Englishes that we're talking about. So to the extent that we haven't paid particular attention to increasing levels of literacy, and therefore increasing access to, I think we have to stay as closely as possible to those languages that are creating cultures. Christian. So it's not delusional, it's legitimate.
I'm very happy about this answer. Let me just press you on the case of Nigerian pidgin, where the contact has gone even deeper, and where I think even in Decolonizing the Mind, there's one or two paragraphs where Ngũgĩ makes an exception for pidginized versions of English, like Nigerian pidgin, as genuine African languages. Now, I know this is highly controversial. An African colleague who teaches at the University of Vienna would consider pidgin a threat to the indigenous linguistic diversity of contemporary Nigeria, so it shouldn't be cultivated. Other people would argue that that's the way forward, that the language is spoken by 100 million speakers across the entire population, that it should be technologized. That links up to your point about AI. So that would be an African language of partly European historical origin which is waiting to be developed. So is that are pidgins genuine African languages, or is there the taint of colonialism in them forever, the stigma?
No, I understand. I mean, our role really as linguists is to look at the practices, the ways in which communities use language, and to be less judgmental, I would say, in terms of prescribing and to provide guidance. So I think that with regard to pidgin, Nigerian pidgin, I think that it has a place. I am a little hesitant to call it an African language as yet, but I would not discourage it. I think that the users of pidgin should be allowed to continue using pidgin and to write in pidgin, but the speakers of Yoruba and Igbo and Hausa and other languages should also be given the opportunity to write and learn and express themselves in their languages. So I think it's this coexistence of languages. And notice that even as we suggest instruction in African languages, we are not suggesting that there is no space for English or French or German. I mean, we are saying that these languages are necessary, but that we should invest more in enriching, our various languages through translation. Yeah.
And then discussants have 3 shots, so I've used up 2. So I will now come to my third shot, and that, of course, is the transformations effected by AI. In preparation for your talk, I had a look at Google Translate, a standard tool in the field, and you couldn't really say that Africa is underrepresented. But you and I know that if you translate from English into Yoruba or from French into Wolof, or the other way around, you will get better results than if you copy and paste Kiswahili and then translate into Wolof directly. So is that window dressing? Are the tech? I often find that multinational corporations are among the world's top champions of linguistic and cultural diversity, inclusive employment policies. And so you would think that they are part of the good guys. But then in the real world, what's the potential for the type of translation you have in mind of all these new tools? You and I agree that if you lost the quality of translation that you get, is probably sufficient to find your way back to the airport or whatever. But
I think there's huge potential.
Will the 21st century be the break true of for a happy marriage between technology and translation, so that in 50 or 60 years down the line, humanity in Africa will have the tools? Or is the cultural activism that motivates you in your work for translation across Africa, is that something which needs to be done by human agents? So how do you see the tension and the possible synergies between all these new tools that are coming out of California and Silicon Valley and are getting better all the time, and the Chinese have theirs, and they will manage spoken Swahili into Mandarin in no time at all, and so on?
Yeah. You see, language is not just the technical, transfer. There is the cultural dimension. I mean, these tools will generate an initial draft, as it were, as we fine-tune them, as they become, richer in terms of, corpus. But if you look at the extent of corpus in African languages, it's still very minimal. There is very little investment in the generation of corpus in African languages that would then allow for the intelligence to be accelerated. Therefore, in my view, it is greater investments in corpus, greater investment in fine-tuning the tools, greater sensitivity to cultural nuances, and so on. And that will be rather a long shot. The cultural nuance that requires the human intervention. So our activism in terms of language and accelerated access to knowledge from different cultures is inspired by the recognition of our responsibility to humanity, that all human beings have a right to accessing knowledge wherever it is located, and that we invest in translation to make it possible for them to access that knowledge. The technology will help us generate an initial draft, but sometimes it's so bad that you are better off actually originating that draft yourself, other than reworking that which has been presented to you by this badly nourished technology. But I would still want for us to challenge technologies and to work with technologists to invest more in translation and invest more in harvesting of corpus from African languages. Because that's where I'm located. And I think that we do have a paucity of corpus that would allow for intelligent kind of translation by the machine.
I'm sure there must be many people itching to ask questions. So
thank you, Kimani, for this wonderful talk. And thank you again, Christian, for the discussion.